He was simply known as the old man. He no longer cared to be called by his name. At 67, his hands were marked by work and his eyes were tired from sleepless nights, guarding a story that no one else seemed to want to hear. He wasn't poor, sick, or abandoned, but he felt invisible. What hurt was not the physical loneliness, it was the silence around him. His children talked over him, his grandchildren didn't listen to him, and inside the house, his words echoed, like noise, not advice. For many years he believed that respect would come with age, that it was enough to grow old to be listened to with reverence. But he discovered that time alone taught no one anything. Old age without wisdom becomes a burden, and he, although experienced, felt that there was something essential he had not yet learned. It was then that he heard about a distant master, a man named Confucius, who lived in the city of Lu. They said that his disciples came from all corners of the earth, and that even rulers sought his advice. But what caught his attention most was something else. An old fisherman, when asked what would change his life, replied only, "I spent 3 days with Confucius, and I learned to walk in silence. Now everyone follows me." Moved by this hope, the old man packed a small bag, put in some water and a pair of sandals, and set off on foot. The journey was long, crossing fields, villages, and cold nights. With every step, a question echoed. In his mind, how can someone who gave so much now be so ignored? When he finally arrived at the gate of the temple where Confucius lived, he was greeted with a calm look by a young disciple. There was no questioning, no refusal, only silence and hot tea. After washing and eating, the old man was taken to an inner courtyard where the master was waiting for him, sitting in the shade of a fig tree. Confucius was serene. He was dressed simply, but there was a nobility in his bearing that no clothes could convey. When the old man approached, he did not ask his name or where he came from. He just nodded and invited him to sit down. For several long minutes, not a word was spoken. Only the sound of the wind in the leaves and the birds in the distance could be heard. It was the old man who broke the silence. "Master, forgive my boldness. I am old and yet I feel that I am still not respected. I speak and no one listens to me. I give advice and they laugh at me. Even my children seem unable to see the man I once was." Confucius looked up gently, but replied firmly, "And who is the man you are?" The question sounded like a whisper, but it weighed like a stone. The old man tried to answer. He spoke of his youth, his family, his achievements. He told how he struggled to feed his children, how he taught them values, how he supported them all even in difficult times. But Confucius remained motionless. He waited for the silence to return. Then he said, "Respect does not live in the past. It lives in the living virtue of the present. The world respects those who convey righteousness even in silence, and it despises those who demand reverence with empty words." The old man felt as if he had been stripped naked. For the first time he realized that he had lived demanding a place in the hearts of others, and not building that place within himself. Confucius served him more tea and said gently, "You have come at the right time. The spring of the body has passed, but the spring of the spirit can begin now. It is not too late to learn. It is only too late for those who believe they already know." And then he added, "Do you want respect? Then stop seeking it. Begin to cultivate virtue, and respect will follow you like a shadow follows the body." At that moment the old man knew that the journey had barely begun. It would not be a path of quick answers, but one of profound transformation. And he accepted, without words, the master's silent invitation to finally become a disciple of wisdom. The next morning, before the sun had risen, the old man was awakened by a soft knock at the door. One of the younger disciples invited him to accompany him to a field east of the temple. There Confucius was already waiting for them, standing silently in front of a large bamboo grove. The dew still glistened on the leaves, and the wind blew gently, causing the bamboo to sway in unison. "Look," said Confucius, his eyes fixed, on the green stalks bending in the wind. "What do you see?" The old man reflected for a few moments before answering. "I see fragile trees. They bend easily. Confucius smiled. And yet, they do not break. Have you seen what happens to the old oak tree during a storm? The old man nodded. He had seen many oak trees fall in his village, broken by the weight of the winds. Bamboo bends, oak resists, but what remains standing when the wind passes is always the most flexible. The silence between them was filled with the sounds of nature. The master walked among the bamboo and with a gesture invited the elder to follow him. In old age, many try to maintain the rigidity of youth. They want everything to remain as it has always been. They demand obedience. They demand recognition. But the rigidity of the old becomes a burden in the eyes of others, and no one respects a burden. The old man felt a slight discomfort in his chest, not out of arrogance, but because he recognized the truth in the master's words. So many times he had imposed his will on his children, so many times he had tried to teach them by force of voice rather than by example. So the old man must give in to everything? He asked with sincere concern. Must he accept even disrespect? Confucius paused and looked at him firmly. Giving in is not the same as submitting. Bamboo does not cease to be bamboo when it bends. It merely responds wisely to the wind. What I mean is that there is greatness in knowing when to be silent, when to listen, and when to speak with purpose. The old man looked at the gently swaying leaves and understood for the first time that bending was not a sign of weakness, it was a sign of maturity. He had spent his life trying to be as firm as a rock, but perhaps it was time to learn from the bamboo. What do I do then when I want to be heard? Confucius replied simply, be presence, not speech. Words are like the wind, but true. Presence that shapes those around you without them even noticing. They continued walking among the bamboo, and the elder noticed how everything there seemed calm, even in motion. There was no effort, there was no dispute, only balance. Upon returning to the temple, the elder did not speak much. He spent the rest of the day observing more, listening more, and interrupting less. For the first time, he felt that he did not need to assert himself in order to exist. At dinner time, he noticed that the younger disciples began to listen to his words more attentively, not because he spoke louder, but because he spoke only when he had something to say. That day, he learned that true authority does not lie in being rigid. It lies in knowing the right moment to bow and the right moment to stand firm, and that in old age, the most respected are not those who shout, but those who remain calm, even when they are not heard. On his third night at the temple, the elder was invited to dine with the master. They sat in a modest hall, lit only by the flickering light of oil lamps. There were few dishes on the table, plain rice, cooked vegetables, hot tea. The other disciples would eat in silence in another room. The elder hoped that this moment would be special. Perhaps the master would reveal a profound teaching, tell ancient parables, explain the secret of the respect he so sought. But to his surprise, Confucius did not say a single word. Throughout dinner, the master ate in silence, chewing slowly with restrained gestures and total presence. His eyes, however, were alive, attentive to the elder's every movement. It was as if each act, serving tea, lifting chopsticks, resting the spoon, had a symbolic value that escaped language. The elder, bewildered, broke the silence. Master, will you not teach me anything today? Confucius looked up kindly but did not answer. He continued to eat, unhurried, as if time had a different rhythm there. The elder backed away, respecting the pause. He felt uneasy. For him, silence always meant absence. Silence for his generation was for those who had nothing more to say. But there. That silence seemed full, heavy, as if it had a life of its own. When the meal was over, Confucius stood up, calmly wiped his hands with a white cloth, and finally said, "Today I taught you the most difficult thing." The old man raised his eyebrows in surprise. "But you didn't say anything." "Exactly," replied the master. "And yet you learned something." The old man did not know what to say. He felt that something had changed within him, but he could not name it. It was as if the absence of words had opened up space for a new form of perception. Confucius approached him and added, "The old man who tries to teach by talking too much seems insecure. He who lives in silence with consistency teaches by his mere presence. Those who teach by shouting may be feared, but those who teach in silence are remembered." The next morning, the old man walked through the temple courtyard, in silence. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to be noticed. He didn't want to prove anything or justify his place in the world. He just walked, he breathed, he observed. And then he noticed something curious. The younger disciples, who had barely looked at him before, were now watching him more closely. One followed him with his eyes as he tended to the plants. Another served him tea without being asked, not out of obligation, but out of reverence. The elder finally understood that silence can be more educational than speech. That true authority does not need a voice, and that in old age, when you choose to live with presence and silent wisdom, respect is not demanded, it is offered. He remembered a phrase spoken by the master at the end of dinner. The soul, felt peace does not need to explain its depth, it just is. And on that day, without uttering a word, the old man taught more than he had in years of trying to be heard. He realized that respect begins when we stop fighting for attention, and we become just what we are, with clarity, consistency, and serenity. The next morning, Confucius asked the elder to accompany him on a seemingly mundane task, sweeping the temple courtyard. The elder hesitated, not out of pride but out of strangeness. He had traveled for days, sought advice on honor, on the value of old age, and now the master was offering him a broom? Still, he obeyed. He began to sweep as best he could, somewhat distracted, preoccupied with the dust and dry leaves. Confucius watched him from afar without saying a word. He simply observed his gestures, his rhythm, his silence. When they finished, the master approached and said calmly, "The way you swept the courtyard reveals more about your soul than 1,000 words." The old man, surprised, tried to defend himself, "But it's just cleaning, master." Confucius walked across the courtyard, pointing with his eyes to the small leaves the old man had left behind, the corners that had been ignored, the haste in his movements. "Everything you do speaks about you, even when no one is looking." The old man felt his face flush, not out of shame but out of understanding. In his life he had become accustomed to doing only what was necessary. He rushed through his daily routine to take care of his children, the fields and the bills. But now, in his old age, he realized that he had lost the habit of paying attention to details. Confucius continued, "Silent discipline commands respect, care in your gestures, order in what you touch, the firmness with which you fold your clothes or serve your food. All of this communicates who you are." Later in the dining hall, the elder watched the master more closely. He noticed that he adjusted his robe before sitting down, washed his hands delicately, placed his utensils symmetrically, and served tea with both hands, even though he was among disciples who revered him. Nothing was casual. Every little act carried meaning, and somehow this created a field of silence and respect around him, without him having to raise his voice or raise his eyebrows. The elder then remembered his own home, the shoes left at the entrance, the papers piled on the table, the clothes chosen in a hurry, the heavy gestures of someone who no longer saw any point in taking care of himself. All of this, he now understood, was a language. "When the old man abandons himself, the world abandons him too," said Confucius, as if reading his thoughts. The old man took a deep breath. It wasn't about vanity. It wasn't about showing off. It was about communicating to the world through the details that he was still alive and that his presence deserved attention. That night, before going to sleep, he calmly folded his clothes. He cleaned his shoes. He organized his mat. He washed his face patiently. And when he looked at himself in the small copper mirror in his room, he didn't see just an old man. He saw a man returning to inhabit his own body. The next morning, as he walked through the temple, he felt that something had changed. Not in others, but in himself. He walked more upright. He looked people in the eye. His gestures had direction. And then he understood. Every little detail is a statement of who you are. Respect comes from within, organizing and expressing itself, even in the way you hold a broom. Confucius, seeing him pass by, simply smiled. There was no need to explain. It was a day of rest at the temple. The younger disciples laughed under a tree, playing with dry leaves as if they were coins, inventing games and teasing each other with jokes. They were noisy, sometimes silly. The elder, passing through the courtyard, looked at them impatiently. He thought to himself, "How can they be so childish? They have such a wise teacher, and they waste their time like this." His face contorted. In an involuntary gesture of disapproval, one of the young men, noticed and ashamed, lowered his eyes. The others were silent for a few moments, until the laughter ceased completely. The atmosphere, previously light, was now heavy. The old man continued on his way to the rock garden, where Confucius was waiting for him, seated. The master asked nothing. He merely observed. "They were being disrespectful," said the old man, as if to justify his expression. "They were shouting and playing like children. Is that appropriate for those who are here to learn?" Confucius picked up a smooth stone and placed it on top of another, slowly forming a small tower. "Were you ever young?" "I was," replied the old man. "But I didn't have time for such nonsense. I had to work, tend the land, feed my family." "Then you learned early to judge those who laugh," said Confucius gently. "But you didn't realize that laughter is often just a way for the soul to breathe." The old man fell silent. He had never thought of it that way. For him, laughter was almost a form of laziness, a waste of time. "Judging is easy," continued the master. "Just look from the outside, compare it with what you believe to be right, and pass sentence. Understanding is more difficult. It requires you to put yourself in the other person's shoes. It requires humility." "But if I don't judge, how will I know what is right?" replied the old man sincerely. Confucius stood up and began to walk through the garden, his bare feet on the ground. "You don't have to judge to understand. You don't have to approve to accept. You can see the mistake and still look with compassion. You can disagree and still keep an open heart." They stopped in front of a small pond where leaves floated on the surface. Confucius pointed to the reflection of the moon in the water. "Look, the water reflects the moon, but it does not try to change it, it just receives it." The elder looked at the reflection and felt something break inside him. He remembered so many times when his children had tried to talk to him, but had been interrupted by his judgments. How many times he had closed doors without realizing it. How many times he had pushed away when he only wanted to draw closer. "Master, do you mean that I pushed people away with my eyes?" Confucius nodded. "The old man who looks with judgment becomes a thorn. The old man who looks with understanding becomes a cool shadow on a hot day. Young people are drawn to those who listen to them, not those who correct them at every turn." That afternoon, the old man returned to the courtyard where the younger disciples were. He sat down nearby, saying nothing. He did not correct them. He did not give them guidance. He just stood there, present. One of the young men offered him a cup of tea. Another shared a piece of fruit. And in that simple gesture, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. He learned that respect is not born of judgment. It is born of acceptance, and that often all others need is a look of understanding. As the days passed, the elder began to observe more than ask questions. He now realized that in the Ege temple, nothing was left to chance. Everything had a rhythm, an intention, a serene clarity. But there was something that caught his attention: the simplicity with which the master himself lived. Confucius slept on a thin straw mat with a worn but clean blanket. He ate little and with gratitude. He wore the same clothes almost every day, always with sobriety and neatness. He walked slowly, greeted everyone with reverence, and never seemed to be in a hurry. The elder, accustomed to associating respect with grandeur, with formal clothing, a deep voice and authoritative gestures, was surprised by the silent impact of the master's presence. "Master," he said one morning as they walked together through the woods, "why do you live with so little, even though you could have so much?" Confucius smiled without vanity. "Because those who are concerned with the essential have no time for the superfluous. And those who know the value of what is simple are free. The old man thought of everything he had accumulated throughout his life. The tools, the furniture, the gifts he had kept but never used. And more than that, he thought of the words he had accumulated, the demands, the old grudges he carried in his heart as if they were medals. But what about respect? He insisted. People don't respect those who seem too simple. Confucius stopped at the edge of a fig tree and replied, "Those who live simply but with firm principles command respect without raising their voices. What is simple attracts attention when it is true. What is pompous, without virtue, soon tires the eyes." The old man remembered a former neighbor, an elderly man who wore modest clothes and spoke little. He was always remembered fondly and listened to attentively. He never flaunted anything, but his presence was enough. When he spoke, everyone fell silent. Now he realized it was because of the quiet consistency of his life that he was respected, not because of titles or possessions. Back at the temple, the old man began to organize his space better. He folded his clothes more carefully, tidied up his small resting area, and offered to help with chores without expecting praise. He began to say no gently when something didn't seem fair to him, without raising his voice or hardening his face, and he noticed something curious. The less he tried to please, the more he was heard. The simpler his manner, the more the young people sought him out. And the more steadfast he was in his principles, the more others respected him. One evening, a younger disciple approached him and asked, "You are different from the other old men I have known. How did you learn this?" The elder thought about responding with a speech, but just smiled and said, "I began to unlearn what I thought was respect." That night, he clearly understood what Confucius meant. Respect comes not from appearance, but from essence. And when someone lives truthfully, without excess, without pretense, without the need for approval, the world gradually bows down. On the penultimate morning, the old man walked beside Confucius along a narrow path between the woods and the lake. The silence between them was comfortable. There was no longer that eagerness for answers, no rush to understand. The old man was beginning to realize that many lessons are not learned through words, but through living together. Still, there was something that troubled him. "Master," he said, watching the reflections in the water, "even with everything I've learned here, my children haven't changed. They don't care, they don't ask how I am, and my grandchildren, they seem to live in another world. How can I guide them if they don't listen to me?" Confucius stopped walking, looked at the horizon and said calmly, "You don't need to be their compass. You need to be their mirror." The elder frowned, not understanding immediately. "Mirror?" "Yes," replied the master. "The compass points the way. The mirror only reflects. The compass demands that others follow. The mirror invites others to see themselves." "And that's enough?" "It is enough," said Confucius. "When you try to guide those who do not want to be guided, you exhaust yourself. But when you live your truth with dignity, even in silence, your life becomes a powerful reflection, and those who love you, even if late, will recognize themselves in your example." The elder was silent. He was beginning to understand. For years he had tried to convince his children with advice, warnings, and criticism. He wanted them to follow the path he believed was right, but now he saw, the more he tried to control them, the more they pulled away. Not out of malice, but out of self-defense. "So, should I give up on them?" he asked. "Never," replied Confucius, "but give up trying to change them by force. Be who you want them to be. Live what you believe is right, and let them be inspired when they are ready." The old man remembered the fig tree in the courtyard. It had been there since he arrived. It never said a word to him, but every morning he sought its shade to sit in. It was stable, reliable, present. There he understood that true authority does not demand, it remains. And by remaining firm and serene, it naturally attracts. Later in the temple, he saw a young disciple arguing heatedly with another. The elder approached, not to reprimand, but just to be there. He said nothing. He just watched with the calm gaze he had learned from his master. The two young men, embarrassed, lowered their voices. They apologized to each other. One of them even approached the elder and thanked him. "Your presence made us think." And he realized, with humility and gratitude, that he was finally becoming what he had always sought, someone whose mere existence commanded respect. That night, as he watched the moon reflected on the calm surface of the lake, he remembered his master's words. The mirror does not change the other, but it shows what he has not yet seen in himself. And he understood. The mission of old age is not to guide the steps of others. It is to illuminate one's own path with such truth that others will one day want to follow the same trail. The last day arrived without warning. The elder woke up before dawn as he had done since arriving at the temple. But on that day something was different. The morning silence seemed lighter, and within him there was a peace he had not felt in a long time. It was not euphoria nor arrogant certainty. It was a kind of inner acceptance, as if he had finally found what he didn't know he was looking for. He calmly tidied his mat, folded his clothes as he had been taught, and washed his face with reverence. He placed his shoes neatly against the wall and went out into the courtyard, where his master was waiting for him in the shade of the fig tree. Confucius greeted him with a simple nod. There was no need for ceremony. Both knew that this would be their last meeting. "Are you leaving?" asked the master, without looking directly at him. "Yes," replied the old man, "but I take with me more than when I arrived. I can't say exactly what has changed. Perhaps it was me." Confucius nodded, as if confirming a truth that the other had to discover for himself. "When you arrived, you wanted the world to bow down before your age, but the world only bows down before those who have straightened themselves out inside." The old man remembered his arrival. Tired, frustrated, full of grievances and demands. He wanted quick answers, ready-made solutions. He thought respect was a natural right of old age. But he learned that time alone does not educate. Experience only becomes wisdom when it is crossed with humility. "I thought I needed to teach my children," he said thoughtfully, "but it was I who still needed to learn." "Teaching is not talking," replied Confucius. "It is living with such integrity that others wish to imitate your silence." The old man took a deep breath. In his entire life, he had never thought that the path to respect began with abandoning the need to be recognized. But there he was, serene, whole, ready to return. Before leaving, he bowed slowly and deeply, not out of protocol, but out of gratitude. Confucius did not interrupt him, nor did he respond with words. He just bowed his head slightly as if acknowledging the other's journey. On the way back to the village, the old man noticed the same landscapes with different eyes. The stones on the road no longer seemed like obstacles, but silent companions. The wind that had previously bothered him was now refreshing. Each step was a gesture of rediscovery of himself. When he arrived home, no one was waiting for him with a celebration, but he didn't expect it either. He put his bag aside, greeted. His grandchildren, with a calm smile, sat down in the garden and began to sweep the porch floor. His children looked at him from afar, surprised by his silence, his tranquility. In the days that followed, they realized that he no longer insisted on giving advice or repeating old stories. But he wasn't silent out of fear either. He spoke. Less, but with more depth. He corrected less, but inspired more. Little by little, they began to ask for his opinion, not out of obligation, but out of respect. His grandchildren, who had previously seen him as part of the furniture, began to seek his company, not to hear sermons, but simply to be close to him. And in that silent presence, they learned more than they did in the classroom. The old man then understood the master's greatest teaching. When the soul is straight, the world bows. It wasn't magic, it was consistency. It was the weight of the presence of someone who didn't need to convince anyone, because he had already become the truth. Years passed, and the old man, now with a more bent body, remained as steady as the bamboo he had learned to admire. He never demanded attention again. He never begged for respect again. And for that very reason he became impossible to ignore. If this reflection made sense to you, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to receive more reflections and stories like this one. That way you won't miss any new content. Take care and see you next time.